I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and welcome to the Undisclosed Addendum. Today we're talking about episode 11 of the new season of Undisclosed. It's about Jeff Titus, who was convicted of the 1990 murders of Doug Estes and Jim Bennett 12 years after the double homicide in 2002. Jeff Titus is currently incarcerated in Michigan and has always maintained his innocence. If you haven't listened to the episodes we're going to be talking about, pause this podcast, go back and listen, and then come back to listen to this conversation. We will still be here, and it will be worth it. Joining me today is a really special guest, Tali Farhadian Weinstein. Tali has been a Supreme Court clerk for Sandra Day O'Connor, worked in the Obama Justice Department, was general counsel in the Brooklyn DA's office, and now is running her first political campaign. Her podcast, Hearing, is focused on how we build a better criminal justice system. She hosts thoughtful conversations with policy experts, journalists, and community members, all engaged in the battle for a more progressive justice system. Tali, welcome to the Addendum.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And also with us is Susan Simpson, one of the hosts of Undisclosed, lawyer and super investigator behind the investigation of the Titus case. Hello, Susan.
Hey, Rebecca.
Now, Tali, you just heard me do a very clean description of your podcast, but I want the listeners of this show to know more about it. So can you just tell us about what you're trying to do with this podcast?
Sure. So as you said, I am running for office. I'm now running for District Attorney of Manhattan. And the podcast is sort of an extension of that for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously, we are in a pandemic. And as I was thinking about, well, how can I actually reach voters across Manhattan when we are all so isolated from one another, it seemed to me like this medium would be a really good way to get into people's homes, into their ears, and to give them some exposure to what's at stake in this campaign. And, more broadly, there have been very few political campaigns who have used podcasting, and it seems to me like there's a lot you can do with this medium because you can really demonstrate in long form who you are, how you think about issues, how you work your way through a hard question. Some of the things at stake in criminal justice reform right now, for example, really just take sustained focus and conversation. And I'm trying to demonstrate that on this podcast.
I'm curious, what do you think? And we talk about this a lot on this podcast. We talk about it on my podcast. There's obviously a lot of challenges and a lot of problems with the criminal justice system, but you're running for a very high-profile DA office. Mm-hmm. What are your priorities? What are the first challenges, if you could do anything that you would take on if you win this election?
Sure. So, I think about the pie of resources that we have in law enforcement as prosecutors. And I think, first of all, what are the cases that we've been doing that really are not making anybody's lives better and in fact are often making people's lives worse? They're not advancing public safety. They're not getting to the root causes of the problems that have expressed in crime, and really to just stop that, right? To shrink or to pull back. And then to say, well, who are the people who we haven't been looking out for? Where have we not really seen the vulnerable person who needs the protection and the support of law enforcement? And how can we do better in those areas? And for me, top of that list is gender-based violence and gun violence, and really just delivering on this idea that everybody's entitled to feel safe wherever they are. So that's one piece of it. And then the other thing that I think about as I think about my ambitions for this office, and this I think, relates to the subject of this podcast, is we really have to reckon with where we've gotten things wrong as institutions and fix those things. Right. And conviction review is very much a part of that. And so I did supervise the conviction review unit in the Brooklyn DA's office, where I last worked. Many regard that as the premier conviction review unit in the country. And I'm very much hoping to bring to Manhattan a robust conviction review program.
Yeah, I feel like a comparison of the Manhattan and Brooklyn CIUs is sort of a case study in itself in how what could go wrong and right with those kind of programs.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'll tell you, I was once in a room full of lawyers where someone asked, well, why have there been so many exonerations in Brooklyn and so few exonerations in Manhattan? And somebody volunteered, well, it's because the policing and the quality of prosecutors is just so much better in Manhattan. And I thought, I don't think that's why.
That is likely not the factor we're looking for here.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what has your experience been in dealing with prosecutors who, we talk about it all the time on this podcast. It's an adversarial system. Prosecutors are competitive, and it's very hard for them to give up their wins a lot of the time. So what's that conversation like for you when you're looking at a potential wrongful conviction to get a prosecutor to just let go of the idea that it doesn't say anything about them personally, that they made a mistake. It says more about them if they rectify it. Like, how do you have that conversation?
Well, there's so much to unpack in that question, and let me try to break it down. I mean, first of all, we all, just stepping even outside of this question of best practices in conviction review, we have to step out of this idea that it's about wins and losses, right? I mean, we are supposed to be ministers of justice, and ultimately we're supposed to be searching for the truth. And we have to help prosecutors understand that their work should not be measured in terms of wins and losses, but in the quality of what they've done and in whether they've created more or less, safety for communities. And, I think that there are lots of ways to sort of put that into motion. And some of it is in how you do the work of conviction review and what lessons you're sort of teaching everybody in the office when you do that. The way you ask the question also sort of stayed in my mind, how do you get them to let go? Well, a pillar of best practice in conviction review is that it's not really up to the trial prosecutor to let go of something, because conviction review should be really independent from the rest of the office. And there are different ways to structure that, but the basic idea has to be there that, somebody else has to be doing this look back, because, it's only human to look at your own past work differently. And with sort of personal investment and concerns about shame and reputation and all of that. And then I think the most important thing is to create both for when you're looking back and more importantly in the work that you're doing going forward, what Barry Scheck calls a just culture. So a culture in which people feel comfortable at various stages of a case coming forward and saying, I'm just not sure what to do here. This is hard. This is a dilemma. I'm feeling different kinds of pressures, or I just don't have the training or the expertise, or my supervisor is pushing me to do something that doesn't quite feel right. What are my independent obligations in this scenario? And I think if you do, and this is really, to me, the ultimate goal, if you have an atmosphere in which that kind of openness is encouraged, then you'll stop a lot of the mistakes and misconduct even before it happens. And then when it does happen, it will be easier to sort of assimilate, absorb, learn from, and prevent from happening again.
I'm just thinking about, first of all, I want you to think about this. I'm going to give you a chance to think about it when I'm asking another question that you're going to answer while you're thinking of the answer.
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I could do two things at the same time.
Okay, you are running for Manhattan District Attorney, so I want you to think about how you would answer. Who is your favorite Law and Order or SVU Manhattan DA? Okay, put a pin in that. But I'm
furiously Googling over here.
Okay, that's okay. If you don't know, that's okay. But I am curious about, the trickle down effect of that when it comes to police, because I know, as a former New Yorker, as somebody who's watched literally every episode of Law and Order, and as somebody who follows politics in New York, especially around the current mayor, that, the police really do, in many, many places, but I think New York is a great example. Like, they're a block. They have a union. There's definitely like we're just following the rules that we were given and doing the best we can sort of thinking. And they often see things like conviction integrity units, or perhaps, even their own accountability departments, internal affairs or whatever, as, crossing the blue line by pushing back on investigations, on procedure or whatever. So is that part of it too? Are you hoping that the DA's office, because they work closely with police, that some of that thinking could trickle down if you take what is it called? The culture of that you said Barry Scheck called it?
A just culture.
A just culture. Do you think that could trickle down to like the street level law enforcement in a place like New York?
Well, I would hope so. And I would say we have to do our part then. And part of that is not just correcting the wrongs of the past and vacating wrongful convictions, which is obviously really critical, but being transparent about what went wrong so that we give people a roadmap, whether it's in prosecution or policing, to do things differently. And otherwise, we're just condemned, right, to repeat the mistakes of the past. And so, one of the things that I did in Brooklyn was we took the time working with the Innocence Project and with Wilmer Hale to really reckon with the first 25 wrongful convictions in Brooklyn, just to take that body of cases and to say, we are going to lay it all out there, because obviously every wrongful conviction that is vacated involves some reckoning and some admission of error, but it's often done really quietly. Sometimes the records are sealed as soon as the exoneration happens, or it happens with caveats and excuses. And it seemed to us like no one around the country had really taken the time to say, let's just study this and see what went wrong. And we were able to really catalog and to have the credibility of having the Innocence Project really do the cataloging alongside us. Where were the places where the police had made the same kind of error over and over again, or had done something wrong over and over again? Where was it the prosecutors? Sometimes it was the court. Sometimes it was defense counsel. And, we have to sort of put that into the world and own it, I think, if we are going to create the kind of cultural change that you are talking about.
So Brooklyn CIU has done a lot of, it's had certainly a better track record than Manhattan, but there's kind of, I guess, the epitome of, wrongful conviction cases detectives. We have Scarcella and his rampage of false convictions and false confessions. And I'm not going to say all false convictions are based on one rogue cop or something, but there you have this guy that was able to operate with impunity for so long. And there's a temptation to heap it all on him, but really, you don't have something like Scarcella happen unless you have a much more, a bigger problem on your hands.
I agree with you, Susan. And I think if you are heaping it all on one person, then you are really just sort of avoiding the problem. I think that's a fantasy to say that everything would have just been fine if not for this one bad apple. We're all just hearing about this bad apple metaphor all the time. And I think that what we demonstrated in this report, and you could read it online, it's called 426 Years, is sure, we have to look for the bad apples, and then we have to create systems to investigate the cases that they touched, or where the rot might have spread. But these are systemic problems. There is not any sort of category of actor in the criminal justice system who doesn't bear some responsibility for wrongful conviction, and also doesn't have an opportunity to do better going forward.
Well, I'm going to let you off the hook with my other question and assign you a Manhattan District Attorney that you would like the best.
I have an answer, I think. Well, maybe you should assign it to me, and I can also only remember the actor's name and not her character's name.
Nora Lewin. That's the one I was going to assign you, played by Diane Wiest.
There you go.
Yes, you picked the right one. She's the most progressive. She came in between Adam Schiff, who was just grumpy, and Arthur Branch, who was super conservative, played by Fred Thompson. And she, very interestingly, her role was the interim Manhattan District Attorney, appointed by Rudy Giuliani, who made an appearance on Law and Order announcing her appointment. Back when he was regular Rudy Giuliani and not the Rudy Giuliani we have now.
I am loving every minute of this history. And I just have to tell you that I had thought I had seen almost every episode of Law and Order up to a certain point. But the more my career became about Law and Order, The more I
Unless
felt
you
like
wanted to
maybe
watch it.
a medical drama was probably a better choice for me.
That's okay. I review podcasts for a living and produce podcasts, and any minute I cannot listen to a podcast, I am not listening to a podcast. So I feel you. All right. So Susan, would you mind giving Tali just a thumbnail sketch of the Jeff Titus case so we can get into the developments we have in the most recent episode?
Yeah, so Jeff Titus was convicted in 2002 for a 1990 murder of 2 deer hunters who were shot in the woods. No one saw it happen. It went cold for a long time. And then a cold case team came in and started making some miraculous progress. And this episode was about one cold case detective in particular, Detective Michael Workema, and his record in this case in terms of how he interviews witnesses, gets information from them, and how their stories have changed after talking to him.
Now, we should say, I think Tali would be helped to know that the original cops that investigated this case, in particular one of them who's on the podcast, thinks that Jeff Titus didn't do it. Like, he investigated the case originally, and he doesn't think Jeff Titus in prison is the right guy. Right, Susan?
Yep. Ballot and Racema both believe that Titus is innocent because they investigated his alibi. I'm like, well, he couldn't have done it, so let's move on.
Exactly. And his alibi was great.
This is already so interesting because so many of the wrongful convictions that I've seen are about sort of heat of the moment errors or errors that happen very quickly after the crime has been committed. There's pressure to pin it on somebody, and they're rushing and it's a mess. And I find this fascinating that the wrongful conviction came out of a cold case.
Well, there was pressure here too.
I would very much love to see a study done on this. I don't know that one has happened, but I suspect that cold cases are more likely to get wrongful convictions, excluding the DNA stuff. The DNA cold case units, that's one thing. Putting that aside, I feel like cold case units are just a recipe for problems to happen.
Well, Susan, talk about that, because we had a similar situation here in my state. I can't speak to the integrity of the convictions that have resulted from it, but just like in my state, this cold case unit was formed. They were given a limited period of time and a limited budget in which to solve cases, and they basically used cases as a way to justify their existence, right?
Yeah. Anytime you tell someone solve this crime or your job goes away, that's bad. You should not do that. That's going to get you somewhere you don't want to be.
Yeah, to the point about wins and losses being the measure of success, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we did hear about this cold case detective, Mike Workema's interview technique and how he was able to get witnesses to completely change their stories, witnesses who had talked to the cops back when the crime was committed versus before the 2002 conviction. Susan, can you just describe Workema's technique so Tali can enjoy what he did here?
So Workema, this is not like a secret. He's proud of this technique. What he does,
he says it on tape. He's excited about it.
He'll go talk to a witness, hear their story. Then he'll go talk to a new witness, find more information or find some more nuggets. I think is what he called them. And then bring that back to the first witness and try and awaken a memory to make them recall it. And he'll do that like 6 times. And by the end, he'll have awakened a memory of what he was hoping to remember. Now,
that's the expression he uses.
This is literally how you make false memories. Like this is what you do to make a false memory in someone. It's just straight up how you do it. You repeatedly give them information, tell them it's corroborated, tell them that others recall this happening, and do that enough times, and people will flat out start having false memories. You can repeat it over and over again. You'll have a decent portion of them will come out thinking that they remember something that didn't happen.
Thoughts, Tali?
Yes, many thoughts. And so, as I said, I don't know anything about the particular case other than what you've told me, but it's ringing a lot of alarms for me in the way that you describe it. First of all, we know that biases in witnesses and in law enforcement about what happened are really hard to dislodge. Right. And so this is true for eyewitnesses. This is why, honestly, sometimes eyewitnesses make honest, tragic mistakes. If something is fed to them that sort of locks in, and it can be really at the heart of bad policing. And so if you're describing to me a process where he has made it difficult to dislodge a false account, that is really really concerning. I'd be interested also to know the age of the witnesses that he used this technique on, because we know that young people are more susceptible to this kind of thing.
The witnesses here were generally older. The most prominent category,
because he was doing it with the cold, at the time after the trail ran cold.
Yeah, and they're actually all kind of older at the time too. But the defendant's old coworkers from like 10 years before are a substantial proportion of the witnesses called at trial, and it was a combination of a very gossipy workplace culture, and then the cold case guys come
Jeff's
in.
personality, which
and
is
that,
not,
and that.
He's not well liked just as a person.
And then the cold case. But even despite that, despite the fact that he had some people at work who didn't like him, none of these stories came out until the cold case team got involved. In fact, during investigations into Jeff at work, none of his coworkers recalled anything along the lines they testified to later at trial. It was only once the cold case team got in there, did repeated interviews, only recorded 1 or 2 of them at most, that suddenly they recall all this fantastical stuff.
I'll tell you a case that I think is somewhat analogous that this brings to mind, and I think really demonstrates the problem of feeding memories to a witness. So one of the cases I supervised involved the then defendant who confessed to stabbing the murder victim in the heart. And this confession sort of traveled with him, and it was really the basis on which he was convicted. And it turned out that the officer who interrogated him, at some point in between the interrogation, so, as you say, this is iterative, so not the first time you talk to him, but like, let's say time 2 or time 3. Before then, he had heard from another witness that the victim had been stabbed in the heart, because that witness was a doctor who was kind of new at what he was doing. And he had mistaken a gunshot wound for a knife wound. So the victim had actually not been stabbed in the heart.
Okay, but I have questions. Can't you, I feel like you can tell the
But that's what I know you think you could, but he was in the ER.
Okay, yeah, it's in the moment.
I don't know what to say about the doctor, but it seems to be, yeah, I don't know what to say about him other than it seems to me like he, let's say, honestly made that mistake, transmitted it to the detective to the police officer who did not go in and tell the defendant, this is what I got from somebody else. Instead, he just told him this is what had happened. And like your scenario, got him to make a false confession. And everyone just sort of continued to confirm this bias throughout. Ultimately, he was convicted for confessing to something that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's even crazier because when he came and asked for his conviction to be reexamined, that wasn't even the reason he gave. He gave other reasons. And it was because of an independent investigation that we said, okay, there were some other problems in the case too, but whoa.
Yeah. So we know false confessions happen. People will confess to crimes they did not do under the right circumstances. Now, apply that to witnesses. People who don't like a defendant, what's it take to convince them to give a false statement or false memory against them? The bar is going to be way lower in terms of self-preservation. And I feel like we as a society don't account for the fact that there are a ton of witnesses who tell the false information on the stand, either lying or they remember it wrong, to a very heavy degree. There are people, juries assume people are telling the truth on the stand, but they're not. A very large amount of the time, they're not.
That is just terrible policing and prosecution, because the very first thing you're supposed to do is to figure out the incentives of your witnesses. Who do they have beef with? Who do they hate? Who insulted them? Who do they want out of the neighborhood? Whatever the case may be. And of course, you were supposed to disclose to the defense any information that might reflect on their credibility, so that defense counsel can work with that as well.
Well, these detectives are very aware of incentives and people's motivations, because they were offering them $5,000 to give them information to help Titus get arrested.
Yeah. It gets wilder and wilder, the information here that you are giving to me, my goodness.
But this was not a secret too. This was an open, the things that Workman was doing, he doesn't feel a need to hide them. He thinks he has a really good, effective technique. He thinks that what he did was great detective work. There's no awareness there that this is all intensely problematic, to understate it. And
then we have to step back and ask, how's he being trained? Who is Who's monitoring this situation?
Oh, he's training. He goes around teaching courses called How to Solve Cold Case Homicides to other detectives in Michigan, and he uses this case as a case study.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's insane to me.
Fascinating.
I've been thinking, Susan, we're talking about biases. Aside from witnesses who may have incentives to lie or have incentives even to change their memory, one of the things that the cops did in this case, and it's the same thing, I think, and you can just confirm this, that happened in the Adnan Syed case when they interviewed all the kids, was they told the kids that they had evidence that he did it, right? When they didn't. The kids ended up becoming some of the evidence that he did it when, they didn't have any evidence. And that's what happened here too, right?
To some degree. I think actually, I also said that was the Baltimore guys were worse about that in general from what I can figure out. These guys made a better show at times, at least from witnesses I've been able to speak to and some of the notes, of saying, oh, if he's innocent, we're here to prove that too. And they did at least have a facade of saying, like, we're not trying to railroad him. We want to talk to you in case he's innocent. So they didn't have the same approach for all witnesses. It's like, oh, we know he's guilty. Now help us figure it out. And I think that reflects the fact that actually there was some serious internal disagreement over whether Titus was a good suspect. They were not a unified bunch. Mike Brown was unified. And like he was the driving force here a lot of the time. But there were, over the 2-year investigation, people found new information. They're like, oh, I'm not so sure about Titus anymore. There's this whole drug thing here that looks kind of like we should definitely look at that. So I think that's kind of reflected in how they approach witnesses.
Well, let's talk about this, because this is the first episode where we've heard, I think, some really credible lines of investigation that were not pursued to the degree they should have. And there was this story here about the McNees, which is such a great Ozark-sounding name from the TV show, and Klump, another one.
Yes, Benny Klump.
Can you just explain the situation so Tali can kind of understand what we're talking about?
Yeah, so on the day these 2 hunters were killed in the woods, there were obviously quite a lot of hunters out, public hunting area. And the parking lot next to the one, or the next one down from where the victims parked, was a group of hunters who went to hunt here every year and had some connections to one of the victims, not directly, but to his stepson and his mom. And as the victim and his stepson are driving into the game area that day, they look over and stepson Bobby sees some guys he knows. He sees the McNees, he sees Benny Klump, and they're like, oh, let's go to an empty parking lot. So they keep going, go to the next one. And then somehow, and I don't have answers here, which I did, somehow the McNees are never spoken to after the murder. And I think this kind of actually goes back a bit to like some of the criticisms of Bruce Orsima, the original detective here. And a lot of people have said like, oh, he's too passive, or he's too, doesn't have that killer instinct or whatever. And I think there's some fairness to that. But when you hear him talk and explain in his own words, it's very clear that he never wanted to falsely convict someone. Like if he could solve a case, great, he's there. But he never felt compelled that he had to solve it. Like if he could not put a case together, then he was totally at peace with himself, saying, okay, I did what I could. I can't get it. I may think I know who did it, but I can't make that work, so we're moving on.
Remind me why the McNees should have been looked into more carefully, aside from the fact that they were just there.
Purely that, honestly, because at the time, they were very close by. They hunted in waders, which means they could have easily crossed Bear Creek and gotten to where the victims were. And I hate to say, especially in this case, I hate to say like something suspicious or weird, because like, you can't judge that. But also it is kind of weird that they kept hunting there after these murders. I would have been gone. And their family's like, that's kind of weird. Maybe we should go home early this year. But we're not gonna. We're gonna stay and hunt.
Yeah. 2 people were murdered doing what we're doing, but let's just hang out
right here. And the other part to me that is also weird is that they did not report that they had a screaming match with Titus's neighbor just 2 days before the murders happened, because they caught trespassing on his land, and that never came up. And like they're not like, oh, right before those guys died, we got yelled at by that guy. Maybe you want to talk to him. Right. Nothing like that. So the Benny Klump thing, unfortunately, we can't talk to him, as we discussed on the show. And for some reason, Vendeville, who was the guy that Titus ended up in prison with and has a long sordid history in Kalamazoo, is either claiming he's convinced, or maybe honestly is convinced, I cannot tell, that Benny Klump is the killer. And the fact that he was there and never talked to definitely is a red flag, as in he's something should have been checked out, although we're left now with very little way to go back and re-examine it.
So here's my question about this, because I know that you are completely aware of this and you make all of these, like, you're very good in the podcast about, saying like, this doesn't necessarily say this, but it's a line that should have been pursued. What is the line between, like, we know another huge way that false convictions happen is, that other inmates say that there was a confession that didn't happen. Like, we hear about this all the time, right? Or they provide information as they're incentivized by getting a deal or whatever. What is the line between believing a fellow inmate and not believing a fellow inmate? When do you take it more seriously, and when do you just say, like, no way, we should just ignore this?
I think you never say you should ignore it. You always have to look into it. I think something like Blackston, he was the guy I talked about before last, who writes a letter saying, the guy I really hate, yeah, he did it. That's when you can be like, okay, we'll eyeball it and, like, check it out. But, like, just in the face of it, you're going to be like, eh. But you look into it for sure. Absolutely.
I agree with you. And I think that there's no sort of special magic about it. You have to bring all of the same skepticism and, secondary investigation that you would bring to any other witness. But in one of the cases that I prosecuted, I found and ultimately convicted the shooter in a murder for hire, a gruesome murder for hire, where he went up ultimately to the wrong person, to just a random bystander, and shot him in the head, thinking that that's who he had been hired to kill. That case began with a jailhouse confession that he made to his cellmate. And so
it can happen for sure. It's not like but
it can happen. You just have to, as I said, you have to be vigilant, as you are with anything else and with any other witness, and understand the particular incentives, going back to our earlier conversation, of why someone might lie in that context. And the jury's entitled to know all of that too.
You have to be more skeptical of those witnesses than any other. Just the whole dynamic, there is no inherently credible way of that information to come out in that context. Doesn't mean it's not real, right, but you have to assume. You have to assume it's probably false to check out anyway. That's the mindset you have to have.
Well, you probably should assume that about everything.
Yes, but doubly so.
Yeah.
But I think that Klomp should be. I mean, you can't say somebody committed one crime just because they did another one. But the way he died, I think, says something about how he lived, maybe, right? I think that he's somebody that should be looked into for this. He killed his wife and then killed himself. He was a person with a lot of issues and obviously had a violent streak, right?
He did.
So, and didn't he have a connection in some way to one of the defendants, maybe?
So it again depends what story you believe.
Right.
There are so many witnesses in this case that the detectives were relying on at times and using. Some of whom who just blatantly wanted a deal. Like this guy, Chuck Lombard, was a guy in prison who is clearly just out for, like, trying to cut a deal. And he's one of the ones that talks about this, like, supposed hit on Doug Estes. And there's others talk about in other contexts. The Vindaville version, the guy in prison with Jeff Titus, his story is that there was a hit on Doug Estes for other reasons by this other guy in the Kalamazoo-Comstock area. And Klomp knew about it. And Klomp would have seen Doug Estes drive in that day. So if he was looking to cash in on the hit, I don't know. That's the whole little theory here. Now, the story is, unlike the Blackston, Charles Dean Lamb story, which didn't make any sense, this story at least is, like, plausible in terms of, like, connections and, like, people who know people. And, like the basic idea is, like, not inherently contradictory to reality, but it's also needs support. And finding support so many years later without having any original interviews is really hard.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's a lot going on there.
But also at the same time, look, you set your cast of characters, you tell the jury what's happening in this case. You say, like, here's who was there that day. Like, the jury got fixated on Titus because the cops were fixated on Titus because the prosecutors were. But in the abstract, if you're just trying to triage a case and you're looking at your list of people who are around, Titus really isn't the standout. Like, you've got some really intense characters there that day, and
yes,
yeah, like, why is Jeff Titus, who's a little bit weird? Yes, okay, he's weird. We all know this, but he's not. He has no record at all, no history of violence, no history of this kind of behavior other than the very normal. I don't want people on my land that are hunting there. My kids
normal for this region, we should say.
I'd say he's even less territorial in some ways. Like, Jeff Titus also is kind of conveniently territorial. Like, He doesn't want people hunting on his land, but he's like, if you're just tracking a deer that's wounded, it's totally cool. I do that all the time. I think it should be okay. For him, because it's what he wants to do. He has no problem with it, but the hunting is bad. Anyway, there's nothing about him that stands out more than these guys like Klump. You're like, okay, that should be checked out.
Right. I mean, I would if I were a cop, figure out everybody who was there and then look and see if any of them had a record, right? Isn't that a thing that one would do?
In this case, yeah, it's a good way of triaging him because you've got, it also still be a long list after that, but but still, it is something they should have, it would have narrowed down like half them at least.
Right. So there was another witness who saw a trailer leaving the area after the shots. Can you just talk about what happened with that witness?
So there was one witness who was hunting across, on the X Avenue, the dirt road they were on. He was a little bit down, but nearby. And shortly after the murders, but long before they ever talked to the McNeese group, a detective talked to him. He's like, yeah, I was there hunting my father-in-law. We heard just two shots, and then we saw this small trailer haul it out of there. And then we heard the screams. And I spoke to him. Unfortunately, he recalled hunting there. He recalled being where he said he was in his notes. He had no particular memories of what he saw that day beyond that. So there was not more to be gained beyond the paragraph in the original detective's notes there. But again, to me, I'm like, this probably should have warranted more scrutiny. You got someone who's fleeing after the shots but before the screams.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you asking Orsima these questions when you talk to him? Because he's definitely the proponent of Titus didn't do it, but he was the one who was in charge of this first investigation. Are you interrogating him about what he didn't do here?
Yes, and he is very willing to talk about these sort of issues, but also he remembers actually pretty well. He has a really good memory. At the same time, he does not recall one of 200 witnesses that happens to say some stuff, because there was a very, very long witness list in this case. So to the extent that, I wish he had more memory about that, but he did not recall so much there.
Right. Okay, so Tali, ready for this?
Okay.
There's one witness in this case who ended up being very important, whose story completely changed from 1990 to 2002, and then completely changed back, apparently, to the 1990 version. Susan, can you talk a little bit about that witness and let Tali know this story so that she can once again comment on how bananas it is?
So in this case, most of the evidence overwhelmingly was evidence of what people who knew Titus heard him say after the murders. Co-workers, other people, stuff Titus said after the murders is basically what the case was. There's only one piece of evidence that actually ties him to the scene that day and away from his alibi 27 miles away. That's one witness who says, oh yeah, I saw him that day. In her very first statement to the original detective, she says that he came by about 8 to 9 p.m., which matches what Titus told them about where he was that day. He says he went to tell him about the murders after he learned of it that evening.
And there's one really good detail that corroborates that, which is that a couple of people said they were eating dinner, just like you eat in Europe. They were eating late, and it's a very specific thing to remember.
I know, it's why it's so vivid to him,
late, just like they do in Europe. Yeah, because it's also something that you don't necessarily associate the people in this story with people who would necessarily follow the eating habits of Europeans. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that in a derogatory way. It's just they don't refer to being European in any other way except in this one instance.
Well, that was actually Orsima. So what it really was, it's a farm. It's a working farm. They often get done with the cows and the fields until way late in the evening. So that's really what the eating late was. Orsima here, since in Germany when I was there in the Air Force or whatever, military, that's when they ate then too. So he has this very precise memory, and it fits Titus. It's all it's all working out the way it seems to work out. Then 12 years later, Titus is arrested. They talk to her again. The cold case team goes to her. Workema, the guy who likes to waken memories, talks to her, and she now says that she saw him at 6:15 to 6:30. Which is when Titus should have been 27 miles away with his alibi witnesses. So it's closer to the murders, but not quite close enough. So by trial, she has now bumped it back more to 5:45-ish when she saw him, which is during the window when the murders happened, and when Titus should definitely be with his alibi witnesses at the farm where he says he was. And the jury hears her, seem to believe her, and she's the only evidence to place him there that day. And he's convicted.
Yeah. So she changes the time by 5 hours or 4 hours. And then she seems to have changed it back, right? Or her daughter changed it
so
back,
I went,
right?
Justin and I talked to her, and then I went back, and both times she was very, like, her memory was pretty clear. She's like, about 8 o'clock. It was late, dark, it was getting late in the day. late in the evening. And the kind of frustrating part was that she had I could not engage. Either I couldn't convince her, or maybe she was being evasive. I'm not sure which. But she was just totally in denial she ever said it was sooner. She's like, no, it was like 8 o'clock. That's when I saw him.
So she denied the testimony that
she didn't really deny it. She's like, I don't remember saying that. Like, no, he was there later. I'm like, okay, well, that's not what you said.
But Susan, didn't the jury hear all of this?
No.
But that's black letter impeachment.
Yeah.
Was it disclosed to defense counsel?
There was a lot that was not disclosed. In this one case, it was disclosed, and yet the defense just ignored it.
Right. Well, so there we have it. I mean, that's such a tragedy because there's a reason why we have to disclose prior statements of every witness.
Well, they disclosed it, but in this one, it didn't help because the defense. So that part of it was that the witness's mother, Bonnie, was the one who says 8 to 9. Her mother was there too to see Titus come by, and she always said 8 to 9. So to the extent there was a trial strategy from the defense, I think it was to say, hey, listen to Bonnie's mother. She's still saying 8 to 9. But
I see. Well, I mean, it sounds like that would be the basis of a motion for ineffective, to overturn the verdict based on ineffective assistance.
In fact, that Titus had several alibis. They only called one, who was not a very good person on the stand. They never attempted to call the 2 detectives who think he's innocent, and also verified his alibi. And they didn't call or try to introduce the written statement made in 1990 of the 2 farmers who saw him there that day. So there was a lot going on. And none of that was ineffective, apparently, according to the courts.
Well, it's something to reflect on that, kind of to the earlier point about Detective Scarcella, it is possible for there to be more than one bad or incompetent actor. And then together it adds up to the tragedy of a wrongful conviction. I mean, in this case, just in the tidbits you've given me, we are seeing problems in policing, problems in prosecution, and problems on the defense side as well.
Yes, this was a holistic effort of wrongful conviction.
Cumulative, yeah.
Didn't her testimony also contradict the state's theory of him stopping by their house to begin with?
See, the part that, Pat Burnworth, the mother, so one thing she does say, and you can tell I think you can tell from the transcript, I wish we had the video, that when Pat Burnworth is testifying, the prosecutor asks her, he's like, oh, so Titus came by in his truck, which is what has to happen if Titus is guilty. And Pat's like,
if it's possible.
Yeah. And Pat's like, no, he was walking. And the prosecutor quickly just pivots and moves on. The defense never notices, never picks it up, and never is like, look, she says he walked there, which fits his story, makes it impossible for their story to be true. The prosecutor's theory is that Titus was trying to look less guilty or less suspicious by stopping to talk to them, by driving. It's nonsense in itself. And yet stuff like that, little clues of the whole story makes no sense, were never seized upon.
Yeah. And they're obvious things. They're not like Susan Simpson level things. I always think I would hate to be up against you as a defense attorney if I were a prosecutor, because you would be like, you said "and" earlier when you meant "the." But these are obvious things that happened in open court. It wasn't 4 days apart, right?
It was not. It should have been, if they'd known the facts, they should have picked up on it, and they just failed to do so.
Okay. Can you talk about Pat Burnworth as a character, as the town gossip, and the effect that had on this case? Yeah,
she, so poor Titus, had, from his point of view, there was never an issue there. He thought they were friendly, not friends, but friendly. She even apparently couldn't confirm it, but it seems to be true. She nominated him for a Neighbor of the Year award because he was always using his tractor to come clear out the snow for her.
Wait, that's an award you can get in Kalamazoo, Neighbor of the Year?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he
didn't trespass. Neighbor of the Year.
So things like that. And he never knew there was a problem until this thing happens when they both testify against him. And from talking to people down there, I've heard from a number of people who recall that Titus was a bad person who did bad things. And very often their source of this information is Titus's next door neighbor, or farm across the street neighbor, Pat Burnworth, who had a impressive variety of stories about why Titus is a terrible human being.
Yeah.
Which are not true.
But she's the source of the things that like became the legend around this case, that like the things that even like the cold case detectives heard were based on things that she had just said. What is her, I mean, is she just one of those people who likes to be a part of something? And so she creates sort of legend around it that then she just tells everybody? I mean, I know people
that
like
is my
I mean, Tali, don't you know people who just like to be involved so they will insert themselves?
Sure.
We all do.
Well, there are some people, it's funny, this is another thing I think about all the time. There are some people who go to any lengths to avoid having contact with the police because it's just not something they've ever done before, right? Like they know that it will change the next few months of their lives if they get involved in some way. That's why you hear people say, like, quote, I don't want to get involved. But this woman seems to be involved in so many different ways. On the one hand, she's a potentially exonerating witness. On the other hand, she's like talking smack about this guy in a million other ways.
Like a town yenta.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the right description.
I spoke to some of her relatives. I will not name them, but the descriptions they gave are exactly what you're imagining. Like, if you had to guess how some of her relatives feel about her, you're probably guessing right. But it was known behavior
not accepting
from
her Facebook request or whatever?
It was known behavior by her that she was... like, again, Titus never had a clue she had a problem with him. And they'd talk friendly. He'd go and, like, use his plow to clear out her driveway every time it snowed. And I think she just enjoyed the drama more than anything. She enjoyed the storytelling and embellishing it. I think it's notable that she does seem to have been mostly consistent, or I say mostly, far more consistent than her daughter was in her statements. She didn't use the crazier parts of her rumors and her police stories. So she seems to have known what was true and not true, or to some degree, but it doesn't matter when you're telling other witnesses that this guy confessed murder to you. That's going to influence their testimony.
Right, because then that influences when police go to them, they think it's true, right? I mean, that's what happens when you hear that. Like, she's the one who says that Titus told her he found the bodies, right?
Yeah, so she does say that at trials, and that's that Titus came by that evening and says, I just found 2 bodies on my property, which... And he didn't find them. Someone else, the stepson found them, and Titus did not do anything to find them. He got home, and the cops were already there, and he's like, what happened? And they're like, there's stuff going on back here. You can't come back here. And then he's friends with the ambulance people who tell him all about, like, there's 2 bodies back there. They were shot. And he goes down to tell that to the Burnworths. And, it's theoretically possible that he decided to embellish the story and be like, I found them. But it doesn't really make sense to me.
He's so literal. It's really hard for me. I mean, I know he liked to sort of like talk himself up as a hunter and all that stuff, but he's also so literal. You know what I mean? Like, he was very proud of having found the gun, it seems, because he told everybody. So Tali, he actually found, and he was one of these guys who like. He saw it as a point of pride that he found the gun and law enforcement didn't. He's like, ha. Like, so he told everybody he found the gun. And because of the rumor mill of this town and his workplace, that sort of morphed into he found the gun and cleaned the gun and was planning on keeping the gun.
Right.
Which is like not what happened. Right. So I have a question about another thing about the Burnworths. This Bob Burnworth detail. This is Pat's husband?
Yes. Never interviewed.
Okay, so talk about that.
Pat's so we have Pat. I don't know. Again, this just never. It's kind of like how the original detectives who had, like, because of various reasons. Well, because their commander decided only one detective could be on this case. I don't know why. That's just insane. Bursima had a huge task list, and just himself plus the volunteer help a ballot eventually to do it, which is part of this. Like, part of why Bursima didn't follow on all these leads up is that he couldn't. He physically could not have done it because there was too much ground to cover. So just like how he didn't talk to Stan Driscoll after he verified with the Shepherds out Titus's alibi, he talked to Bonnie and her mother, Pat, about when Titus came by. He never spoke to Bob Burnworth, the husband.
You mean who the guy who also lives there?
Yeah, the guy who was also there for this whole conversation, yeah. He's never interviewed, and he dies before the cold case team was in. One detail that stood out to me, though, is there's another witness who calls in and says, I was there around this time. This witness did not see much himself. He was there at the right time, but he just didn't, he was driving through and he didn't see the action that mattered. But he did see at the right time. It's like, I drove by and I saw Bob Burnworth standing in his driveway. He would have seen what happened with that car that was going into the ditch. And they never talked to him. And that's an independent witness who can confirm that at the right time, Bob Burnworth was out there, which to me is much more credible than the various Pat stories saying she she saw, whatever.
Well, one of the Pat stories that really struck me is this assertion that Titus, the defendant, had bullets with their names on them, that he was like, if they ever did whatever, like he would kill them, right? Like that was a weird story.
It is.
And what was weirder about it was they seemed to think it was literal. Like when I think I have a bullet with your name on it, it's like metaphorical, but they seem to think literally he had bullets with their names carved in them that he was planning to use,
yes.
right? It's so fabulous. It really is. It's like they built a legend around the alleged evilness of Jeff Titus that just wasn't true.
He is definitely like the story of this monster who lived next door and this great evil, would have been serial killer if he got the chance kind of guy that's just never backed up by the facts there.
Well, one of the things that you point out, and I would love to hear Tali's take on this because I had never thought about this before, is that all of these witnesses who testified at his trial, who had these sort of fabulous stories about him, including the coworkers, including the Burnworths, at some point they become incentivized for him to be convicted because they're saying things about him that if he's not convicted is probably going to come back and bite them, right?
It's part of that, but not even just that. What they're being told by everyone around them is that Titus is a crazy murderer. And I mean, if I heard and believed those things, no, I would not want to live next door to him. I would not want him coming back to be there. So to the extent you can slightly tweak your testimony and make sure he never comes back at all, yeah, that's a real factor, I think, that was at play here.
Or talk about a different kind of confirmation bias. You might go back and sort of blow up in your mind, incidents and memories that you would not have made much of before, but now you've been sort of invited to weave them into this bigger tapestry. And so you also sort of get stuck, you the witness, and you can't dislodge this idea.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find in your wrongful conviction experience, Tali, that even witnesses sometimes who maybe made a mistake or may have misspoken or may have lied, like, is it hard to get them out of that lane when they know they've given testimony that, they've done under oath? Because I think people feel like they're in trouble, right? If they admit that they lied or they admit that they were wrong, right?
Yes, I think making that kind of correction is scary. And, I think that, it just, at a certain point, you might lose your own connection to what actually happened. Once you've been convinced and a system has validated a mistake that you might have made, right?
It's false memory making. Like once you get, like you may not have been totally sure, but you said it, and the system keeps reinforcing what you said, and you're like, oh, it probably was right. That probably was real. And that becomes your memory if it wasn't before. And,
I say this with care because, of course, people who experience trauma testify all the time and their testimony is credible. But we also do know that sometimes the experience of something traumatic can affect how you are encoding the memories. So,
right.
We did have one case in Brooklyn of the wrongful conviction of a man who was convicted of participating in a really brutal gang rape. And it was the kind of crime that just shocks the conscience. And the victim made an honest mistake in folding this man into her memory. I mean, there were multiple perpetrators, and she identified the others correctly and misidentified him.
Tali, I think it also happens in the other direction. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this experience where, somebody in your life tells a story and somehow over time you become convinced you were there also with them. Like it's usually something like kind of positive, like something funny that happened or whatever. And it really is amazing how, that's sort of the way that memory works. You remember what you remember. You don't remember the actual thing. And I always think of all of these situations where, people will say, oh, I would never say that. I would never do that. I would never wrongfully identify somebody. We actually do that all the time in our regular life in unconnected to crime.
I did it last night. I watched a TV show and I was dead convinced my husband watched it with me. And he had to spend like 10 minutes convincing me, no, I watched it by myself, and he was not there. and I fully remember him watching it with me.
Rebecca, I think it's actually a profound point, and I don't want to destabilize everything. I mean, eyewitness testimony is important evidence, and we rely on it. And I should say that many crimes, like the entire, a big part of the world of gender-based violence will only have one witness, the victim, herself or himself. And we have to be able to credit that. But of course, you are right that we're human, we're fallible, our memory is susceptible to so many things. And you don't really learn all of this in law school. And yet these are the issues on which people's liberty turns, right? And stuff, right. Safety and justice turns. So, we could just ponder that. And then I'm just going to say the obvious thing, because it's worth saying. This is why we should try as best we can to corroborate, right? Like that is, right. That's how you get past reasonable doubt with corroboration. And it could be through other eyewitness testimony that's sort of independently acquired, not in the problematic way that you described earlier, Susan, or other kinds of evidence, different kinds of evidence, not just eyewitness testimony. And ultimately, you should be able to buttress, support, all the synonyms we might want to pull in for corroborate in order to give the fact finder confidence, right?
Right, right. I know contemporaneous communication is one way of corroborating, right? Like a text message where I told somebody what I just saw is very helpful.
Well, sure. I mean, as documents, we have a world of electronic evidence that we can use now that we didn't have in so many of the older cases that we go back to, phones that show GPS that shows where people were and what they did. And as you said, what text they sent with an account of a written account of what might have happened. In a way, we really should be doing so much better now because we have so many kinds of evidence that we are able to gather.
Susan, we do have one listener question. This is going to be the final question, and it's a question I had as well. I believe this is in reference to Vendeville, the prison mate of Titus. Somebody says, Talking Tank says, hold on. Theft of a purse from an unlocked, unoccupied vehicle merits 20 to 40 years in prison. That feels ... excessive. Is there more to that story?
I'm going to go ahead and say probably yeah. Unfortunately, our ability to get records has been limited for some of this stuff. And I have, there's a lot about Vendeville that I wish I had more answers to. But, stuff like the jail records, just don't have them anymore for some reason they can't explain. So while I cannot answer the whole question there, it does seem strange. Now, what they do to get this sentence, it was legal under the Michigan law, is that they say it was a home invasion because it was an external garage that had an attachment or entry, like a breezeway. They went to the house. So it was a home invasion, and they made him they said it was a repeat offender, and they used that to get to this 20 to 40 year area. But that does require discretion by the prosecutor. That is not typically a sentence they would try and go for someone who has just been opening parked car doors and just stealing a purse out of it. So, and the prosecutor was not persuaded by Vendeville's statement at sentencing, where he was explaining how much he helped the cold case team solve all these cases.
Right. So, Susan, what is coming up on the next episode of Undisclosed in 2 weeks?
The next episode, 2 weeks' time, will be about Ditchman.
Well, I can't wait to hear about Ditchman. Tali Farhadian Weinstein, it's been a delight talking to you. How can people follow you online aside from your podcast Hearing? Do you have other social media where they might be able to follow you and your campaign?
Yes, you can go to tali4da.com to read about the campaign. As you said, you can find Hearing anywhere where you get your podcasts, or follow me on Twitter. It's Tali Farhadian, and on Instagram, it's Tali Farhadian Weinstein. And I want to thank both of you because it's so great to be in this conversation with you and to just listen to how you work out how we can go back and reconstruct and find our way toward justice in a case. It's really a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, if you become DA, you have to listen to Undisclosed. It will inform your work, I promise. Thank you so much. And Susan Simpson, thanks a lot. I'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more Undisclosed and Undisclosed Addendum. Do you have questions for the next Addendum? Tips about the Jeff Titus case or any of the cases covered on the podcast? You can email your questions to undisclosedpodcast@gmail.com or send them to us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Audio production of the Addendum is by Hannah McCarthy. The executive producer of Undisclosed is Mithil Telhan. Follow the show on social media everywhere at Undisclosed Pod. I'm Rebecca Lavoie. If you want to hear more of my takes, check out my true crime review podcast, Crime Writers On. And for everyone at Undisclosed, have a great couple of weeks.